He was a writer on The Tonight Show for 20 years and has been a full-time speaker and professional comedian for 34. He was a quarterfinalist on the original Star Search with Ed McMahon. He lost to a puppet. Please welcome my friend, the mental health comedian, Frank King.
Woo! Yes, you know, the elephant in the room when I speak is almost always a comedian talking about depression and suicide. How does that work? Well, I think a comedian's a good choice, and I'll tell you why. Number one, comic's job has been, since the time of the court jester, to speak truth to power on behalf of the powerless with humor. And I believe I speak truth to the power of mental illness on behalf of those often powerless in its grip with humor. I believe where there's humor, there is hope. Where there is laughter, there is life, that nobody dies laughing. And three, depression and suicide run in my family. Yeah, there's more nuts in my family than in a squirrel turd. It's called generational depression and suicide. My grandmother died by suicide. My mother found her. My great aunt died by suicide. My mother and I found her. I was 4 years old. I screamed for days. And if you'd like to know how all that happened, I'll spare you the gory details. It's in my first TEDx talk called A Matter of Laugh or Death. And I myself came close enough to dying by suicide that I can tell you what the barrel of my gun tastes like. It was 2010. The bottom had dropped out of the speaking market. My business had dropped off 80%, and we'd lost everything in a Chapter 7 bankruptcy. And well, and again, if you want to know, I guess spoiler alert, I did not pull the trigger. I tell that story almost every keynote that I do, and a friend of mine was in the audience not long ago, and he'd never heard me say that about not pulling the trigger. He comes up afterwards, he goes, "Hey man, how come you didn't pull the trigger?" I'm like, "Hey man, try to sound a little less disappointed." And I believe that my comic ability, my comic timing, so forth, are simply the flip side of my mental illness. I said kind of a superpower, and I said that to my sister, who lives with depression and anxiety. She goes, "Superpower? We're not the X-Men. We're the Zen X-Men." That's my lovely little sister. I taught a class, several rounds of something called Stand Up for Mental Health. And those students with mental illness, you have to have mental illness to get into class, have to have mental illness to teach the class. It's part pure counseling, part comedy class. Were the best comedy students I have ever taught. The stuff that came out of their mouths, unedited, was ready for TV, ready for prime time. I'll give you my favorite 3 examples. Lisa came in one day. She was double diagnosed, depression and alcoholism. She'd just come from an AA meeting. Somebody at the AA meeting had mentioned Christopher Columbus. So I said, "Lisa, what do you got?" She goes, "Well, I think Christopher Columbus was an alcoholic." Okay, I'll bite. She goes, "Well, think about this. His big idea was to sail east to get west. Tell me that doesn't sound like something that an alcoholic would come up with in a bar." And like an alcoholic, he did it. And like an alcoholic, when he got to where he's going, he had no idea where he was. And when he got back, like an alcoholic, he had no idea where he'd been. And like an alcoholic, he got a woman to finance it twice. And that's the way it came out of her mind. Second one is Camille, who had a horrible backstory. I mean, her childhood was just, anyway. I said, "What do you got, Camille?" She goes, "Well, I want to see my shrink." I said, "Well," she goes, I was asked by him, he said, "Are you depressed?" I said, "Yeah." "Are you having thoughts of suicide?" "Yes." "Do you have a plan?" She said, "I have 5 plans." "5 plans?" She goes, "Yeah. Do you want to hear them all or just the ones that involve you?" Oh, it's dark, but it's amazingly funny. And there's not a word in that joke that doesn't move the narrative forward. And finally, Tosh, younger woman, she comes in. I go, "Tosh, what do you got?" She goes, "Well, my boyfriend last night said he wants to break up with me." I said, "Well, why did he say he wanted to break up with you?" She said, "Because he wants to see other people." I said, "What did you say?" "I'm bipolar. Give me a minute."
Let's see. Oh, start the conversation. That's what I get paid for, basically. Most of my clients say to me, "Look, we just brought you in here to start the conversation on suicide," because it's one of those things that, although a goodly number of people die by suicide in the United States every year, hardly anybody talks about it. Talking about it a little more now during the pandemic, the stay in place, the isolation, the social distancing, but not near enough for the number of people who die by suicide in the U.S. every year. This is one of my favorite Martin Luther King quotes. And I think suicide matters. My goal is to work myself out of a job. They go, look, nobody's doing it anymore. You're going to have to quit. Fine, I'll retire. Every year in the United States, 8 million people seriously contemplate suicide. 1.4 million attempt it. And 47,000 die by suicide. That's 1 every 11 minutes. That means at this moment, by the time we get done with this, somebody, more than one somebody in the United States will have taken their lives. This is also my job. You guys know Big and Rich, the singing duo? They have a song called Somebody's Got to Be Unafraid to Lead the Freak Parade. That's my job. By getting on stage, by being vulnerable, by sharing my story, that I live with major depressive disorder and chronic suicidal ideation, and that I can tell you what the barrel of my gun tastes like. I lead the freak parade. I give other people permission to give voice to their feelings and experiences surrounding mental illness and suicide without recrimination. That's truly my job. Again, starting the conversation.